welcome to class. Stokely Carmichael, the 1960s black nationalist who started with SNCC, gravitated toward the Black Panthers, once described the Vietnam War as black men killing yellow men to protect white men who stole land from red men, something to that effect. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the social dynamics of the Vietnam War, and especially soldiers in Vietnam. There's a good deal of work done on this already. It's a fascinating area, and we're going to talk a little bit about it. This also works in conjunction with the essay that's in your reader by Christian Appy from his book, Working Class War. It's not exactly a revelation that wars in general are fought by people who come from the working class, disproportionately are not as economically affluent and probably not as educated as the society as a whole. And clearly this was the case in Vietnam. You can see a clear break when you look at the Vietnam era soldier from those who had some college experience and those who didn't. This isn't to suggest that the entire Army was not educated. There were plenty of college students, college graduates, people from elite institutions, in fact, in the Army. But as Appy points out, it was, for the most part, a working class war. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to start by just reading a couple things from you to kind of give you some sense of the flavor of it. Much of the literature written by soldiers, by especially soldiers of color, African Americans, Native Americans, Chicanos, tends to be fairly critical. And this is a letter from a Navajo Times by an American Indian who served in Vietnam. And he said, "A yellow, low-down, cowardly Navajo, you may think about me, but you are wrong. As a man, I look at the Vietnam conflict as a senseless war in which Americans have been fighting the Vietnamese for over 15 years. As a Navajo, I look at the war as if fighting alongside the white man who tried desperately to annihilate the American Indians and the Navajo, fighting for what was once ours and now to protect what is no longer ours." Perhaps the best known American, maybe the most famous person in the world in the 1960s, was the heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was a Muslim, a member of the Nation of Islam, who refused induction into the service. In Vietnam, actually right here in Houston, he was later convicted for it. One of the few people who was, and Ali's famous explanation for why he didn't want to go to Vietnam was, "No Viet Cong ever called me nigger." I want to also kind of open this up with a little vignette from a fantastic book by Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried. O'Brien is a combat veteran of Vietnam, actually was in Charlie Company. He patrolled the area around My Lai and Charlie Company after the massacre, so this has really had a big impact on him, and he's written considerably about Vietnam, a fantastic novelist. And maybe his most famous short story is called How to Tell a True War Story, and perhaps the most famous passage from it is, "A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or if you feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you've been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie. There is no rectitude whatsoever, there is no virtue. As a first rule of thumb, therefore, you can tell a true war story by its absolute and uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil." I open with these critical comments because they point out one aspect of the Vietnam experience, but there's really an anomalous situation here. Because by and large, the very same types of soldiers, less educated, working class, African American, Chicano, Native American, who could criticize the war in such harsh terms, also served quite effectively, most enlisted rather than were being drafted, and many received honors and awards for their time spent in Vietnam. So there's a real anomaly here. On one hand, you have a real awareness that the Vietnam War was fought by certain groups and certain individuals, certain classes. On the other hand, there's a great deal of effectiveness and even pride in that participation. So we're going to try to get a flavor of both of those. Excuse my little spacing mistake here, but I want to talk about soldiers in Vietnam, and I want to start with just kind of the some fundamental statistics. This was, as Appy says, a working class war. And I want to just talk a little bit about the soldiers in Vietnam, some statistical data on economic status, education, and region. The idea that the war was fought by the working class or African Americans tends to be pretty well buttressed statistically, but it was really an item of gospel during the war itself among not just the anti-war movement, not just among African American leaders, but inside the military. General Creighton Abrams, who replaced Westmoreland after Tet in '68, was quite upset about the composition of the Army and said something to the effect that only the poor, underprivileged, and black now have the great honor of dying for their country in Vietnam. The Army saw the social situation among soldiers in Vietnam disintegrating after Tet, after the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, and immediately began to act upon that. So this, I think, is buttressed statistically, and it was also really a consensus among everybody that the situation in Vietnam really did reflect unequally. The war burden was not being shared equally by all types of people at home. I just kind of give you some statistical information on it. Some of this stuff I may have mentioned before, but it bears repeating. A soldier without a high school diploma, for instance, was 3 times more likely to suffer a casualty than somebody who had graduated from high school. So soldiers without high school diplomas had casualty rates 3 times higher than those who had a diploma. A young man whose family income was in the $4,000 to $7,000 a year range, which I'm assuming today, adjusted for inflation, would probably be somewhere like in the low to mid $20,000 a year range. But a young man whose family had an income in the $4,000 to $7,000 range was 3 times more likely to die or to be hurt than someone whose family income was over $17,000. Okay. In the Vietnam era, there were 2.1 million men who actually served in Vietnam. This was almost exactly 1/4, almost 1/4 of the entire Vietnam era armed forces numbers, which were about 8.5 million. So of that 8.5 million men and women who actually were in uniform in the Vietnam era, 2.1 million actually served in Vietnam, and this is from '64 to '73. This is when the statistics are actually taken. However, there were, let me see something here. This was exactly, okay. That 2.1 million was 25% of the number of men who were actually in the service. It only amounted, however, to 8% of the 26 million Americans who were eligible for military service. So there are 26 million eligible for military service. 8.5 million, about a third actually serve, and of that number, 2.1 million actually serve in Vietnam. 92% of eligible, military eligible men do not serve in Vietnam, which means less than 10% of the population actually fought in Vietnam. Among those, the vast majority of Americans who were eligible by age but did not serve, there were many reasons that they didn't. You could be, exempt for physical reasons. You could fail your physical, mental reasons, psychiatric reasons, moral failure. Obviously, the military, even really as today, considers a moral failure would be things like a conviction could be considered moral failure. Being a homosexual would be considered a moral failure in the military. Many were given conscientious objector status. College students were deferred. There were exemptions, I believe, for people who had children, who were fathers. There were exemptions for teachers, for those who were school teachers, for engineers and other areas that were considered important. Others avoided service in Vietnam by joining the reserves or the National Guard. Still, a few others resisted the draft. They burned their draft cards, refused induction into the armed services, like Muhammad Ali. Some went to Canada or to Sweden. The numbers there are still hard to figure out, but somewhere in the thousands. Okay? So that's generally just kind of a statistical overview. It is not a war fought by the typical American male. The typical American male does not even serve in the military and certainly does not serve in Vietnam. Of those 2.1 million men and women who served in Vietnam, over 58,000, those names on the wall, were killed. That amounts to a little under 3% of the actual number of soldiers in Vietnam, American soldiers. Broken down by services, the Army suffered 66% of all casualties. The Marines accounted for 25% of all casualties, but considering how many fewer Marines were in Vietnam than Army personnel, the Marines actually lost a larger percentage. 5% of Marines in Vietnam were killed, 1 out of every 20, which is a fairly significant attrition rate. 8 women were killed in Vietnam as well. All were nurses. Okay? There were about 11,000 women who served in Vietnam. In addition to that 58,000 killed, there were 150,000 plus, over 150,000, who were wounded seriously enough to be hospitalized. In total, then, there were over 210,000 American soldiers in Vietnam killed or wounded, which is 10% of the entire population that served in Vietnam, 1/10. Now, when you take into account, as I've said before, that most Americans did not see combat in Vietnam, then the number hurt or killed or wounded in relation to those who actually saw combat is quite significant. Almost 1 out of every 4 Marines in Vietnam was killed or wounded. It's a fairly staggering attrition rate. As I said, 5% were killed. When you add WIA, wounded in action, along with KIA, killed in action figures, 66,000 Marines in Vietnam were casualties. 1 out of every 4. The Army had about 10% casualty rates, with about 135,000 killed or wounded. Okay, so again, fairly sizable attrition figures when you take into account that the typical soldier in Vietnam was not involved in direct combat, was in fact in a support role. Jonathan Shea, yeah.
Oh, the 2.1 million you're talking about, that's everyone who
was
in Vietnam, not necessarily participated in combat.
No, absolutely not. That's everybody. And the majority of these people, in the second half of this class, we'll see a talk by Jonathan Shea, who's a well-known writer on Vietnam, and Shea points out that only about 1/5 to 1/4 of Vietnam-era soldiers who actually had an MOS, which stands for, I have it written down.
Of the infantry you're talking
yeah.
about, 11 Bravo
yeah.
is the infantry MOS. Yeah.
Okay, only about 20 to 25% actually had the type of assignment that would have made them, put them at risk of seeing combat. And of that number, not everybody did. So when you look at it, only about 10% of American troops actually were involved in engagements, in military engagements in Vietnam. So that 2.1 million, the majority of that 2.1 million are in the service sector. They're clerks, they're unloading ships, they might be serving beer at the officers' club, they're taking notes, they're serving as aides. They could be, in intelligence, I suppose. I mean, there are many different types of assignments they could have, but the vast majority do not have combat assignments. And even among those who have combat assignments, only I think about half or so actually engage in combat. So when you look at it in that regard, then the numbers are actually fairly significant. The number of hurt and wounded, considering how many saw combat. And you have over 200,000 who are hurt and wounded. So if you actually engage in combat, there's a pretty good chance. I don't do the math, and I'm not a statistician, but I would say it's probably about a 50-50 chance you're going to get hurt. It could be even more than that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think another telling statistic is the military granted, I believe, 300,000 Purple Hearts during the war. So if 150,000 were wounded, really beyond the ability to go back into combat, there were another 150,000 that were wounded, but their wounds were not sufficient to be sent back to the States.
Okay.
So that tells you again that the percentage was very high.
Okay, sure. So yeah, you're going to add, let's say there were some multiple winners, but you're going to still add maybe 125,000 to that. So yeah, you're looking at a real risk. I mean, if you're in the field engaged in combat, then the chances of you getting hit are fairly sizable. It's pretty risky. According to the Department of Defense's statistics on this, not surprisingly, the majority of casualties were privates and corporals rather than officers. In fact, the Marine Corps' losses were skewed incredibly. Over 90% of Marine casualties were privates or corporals. Over 80% of the Army and Marine combined casualties were privates or corporals. One thing, too, when I mentioned before that the typical soldier, I think I mentioned before, the typical soldier was an enlisted man, about 70%. Remember, all Marines, all Air Force, and I believe all Navy are enlisted. So you're going to get 100% enlistment from those branches, and it's the Army which has men drafted into it, and that really, they go to the draftees fairly late in the game. So the first 2-3 years, I believe 65 and 66, maybe into 67, it's mostly an enlisted Army. It is an Army that is incredibly young as well, and this is really one of the striking aspects of it. In World War II, the typical soldier was probably in his mid-20s, married, quite possibly had a family. In Vietnam, it was a terribly young Army. The average age was actually 19. These are teenagers. As this report, this is based on a Pentagon report, says, although it's a truism that the young die in war, one is still unprepared for the fact of the numbers in Vietnam. 40% of the Marines' casualties in Vietnam were teenagers. 40% of that 66,000, about 25,000, were teenagers who were killed or wounded in Vietnam. 16% of the Army's casualties were teenagers. Nearly 1/4 of all casualties in Vietnam were in the 17 to 19-year-old age group. If you expand that to 21 years old, between the ages of 17 and 21, 83% of the Marines enlisted casualties, 65% of the Army's enlisted casualties, nearly 70% of all casualties were 21 or younger. And only the Navy and the Air Force had numbers above that. However, their casualty numbers were relatively small, and these tend to be specialized services, so you're not going to have younger soldiers in them. Okay. And Coast Guard casualties are included in the Navy casualties as well. They're statistically fairly small. No other American war, this report points out, has presented such a young profile in combat. These young men were trained quickly, shipped to Vietnam quickly, and died quickly, many within a few weeks or within a few months of arriving in Vietnam. In terms of whether they were volunteers or enlisted, as I said, 63.3% of all enlisted casualties were volunteers. If you add officers in, then 70% who died in Vietnam were volunteers, not drafted. But as I pointed out, the Marine, Navy, and Air Corps tended to were totally volunteer services. With regard to the, we'll talk a little bit about the makeup of the forces in terms of the ethnicity. We'll talk about African Americans and Chicanos and Indians. But I want to, before I do that, kind of give a little bit of background on it by talking about, I feel like a demographer or a sociologist or something today. But sometimes the numbers are pretty revealing, and they tell you things that a narrative might not. The statistics on regions and states in which soldiers, from which soldiers who died came, is also quite revealing. Geographically, the area that suffered the most dead in Vietnam was the South. I think I've mentioned this before. About 20,000 of the 58,000 casualties, over a third of those, not casualties, deaths, I'm sorry, KIA, over a third of those killed in Vietnam came from the southern states. And I don't believe Texas was included in that group. I believe Texas was included in a different category. I wasn't able to kind of get it from this, but I'm pretty sure that Texas wasn't included as a southern state, which would mean that the numbers would have even been considerably higher. 31, the South suffered a death rate in Vietnam of 31 per 100,000 population. After that, the West was the biggest with almost 30%. So geographically then, the South, not surprisingly, when one thinks about the economics of the war, the South has always been the poorest region. The statistically typical casualty in Vietnam was a poor, young, white boy from the South. And again, the poorest region, the region which had the kind of lowest standardized test scores in terms of education and things like that, and the most typical to be killed in Vietnam. Something else that's important, though, which is really quite striking, among American possessions, territorial possessions, the area that had the largest number of deaths was Puerto Rico, with 345, compared, for example, to the Virgin Islands, which had 15, Guam, which had 70, Samoa, which had 4. So if one lived in Puerto Rico, I think in terms of percentages, Puerto Rico actually had the largest casualty rate in Vietnam. When you break it down even further by state, it's quite striking. There are, let me see, some 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 states here which had the highest percentage of soldiers killed in Vietnam. One state, Maine, is from the Northeast or from the North. The others, the highest percentage, and Puerto Rico is not included in this because I think it would be number 1, but the highest is Hawaii with 25 deaths per 100,000 population. New Mexico, which I'll talk about later, is next. West Virginia, Maine, Arizona, Alabama, South Carolina, and Oklahoma. With the exception of Maine, all of these states, are marked by either fairly significant minority populations or, in the case of West Virginia, Alabama, and South Carolina, fairly significant poverty rates. The lowest death rates in Vietnam by state, Rhode Island, Alaska, Jersey, Connecticut, New York, and Nebraska. Industrialized states, northern states, states with much larger Caucasian populations, except for the case of New York obviously has significant minority populations as well. So just in terms of looking at the numbers, the typical soldier then was poor. As we'll talk about, the numbers of minority soldiers were disproportionate to their percentage of population. The typical soldier, as Christian Appy stuff points out, was not the most educated. Many young men were often given a choice, for example, when facing the judicial system of going to jail or going to Vietnam. I've talked to several people who had that option. Those who had access to a doctor or whose father had connections could fairly easily get a deferment. You could find there were some doctors who were very well known for that. You know, they would write up that you had flat feet or a bad back or your eyesight was bad or something like that. Bill Clinton was able to write a letter from Oxford to the director of the Arkansas National Guard. Dan Quayle's father was able to intercede on behalf of the Indiana National Guard. Whether he pulled strings or not, it's indisputable that George Bush served in the Texas Air Guard during the Vietnam era. There were ways, if one wanted to get out. You could continue going to college. In my own family, my brother was a half-time student for about 6 years. I mean, there were other factors for it, but he also remained, what was the 1F? Was that the deferment status?
2S was the student.
2S, okay. 2S was student status then. So there were ways out. If you've ever seen, read popular literature or seen, kind of movies, this is often something that's played up. Whenever I talk about this, though, I think of the scene in Hair. I don't know if you've ever seen that, where they do the little song and dance number at the draft board. So anyway, you ought to watch it sometime. It's funny. Neither here nor there, but it's funny. All right. Well, let me see. I don't want to kind of beat you over the head with statistics. I think it's a fairly clear-cut picture. Children of privilege or those who had access to college did not have a great chance of going to Vietnam. And if they wanted to find a way out, it wasn't terribly difficult to do so. At one point, I have a statistic, I can't remember it now, where I think maybe 4 officers from the Ivy League were killed in Vietnam or something like that. It's really striking, too, if you look at the World War II statistics, which I didn't have handy. But World War II was a far more, kind of democratic or diverse army. I mean, you had actually, like Franklin Roosevelt's kids fought in World War II. Joe Kennedy's son was killed in World War II. In Vietnam, among national leaders, the only one I can really think of course, John McCain was a POW. He was a flyer, and Al Gore, who think took pictures for Stars and Stripes or something like that. It was not difficult to get out. When you look at the main political leaders of that generation, I mean, a good number of them were I think Tip O'Neill dubbed the term chicken hawks. They were real hardliners in the 80s and 90s, but all of them happened to find ways out of Vietnam. And this, both parties had people of this nature. I mean, Clinton and Buchanan and whatnot. They didn't all reside in one party or the other. So it was a working class war. I mean, I think Appy's research really, and it's based on a lot of statistics too that the Pentagon itself kept and released, and you could see this as well inside the military. I mean, the military understood this and actually was troubled by it. One of the best examples of this actually was something called Project 100,000, which is something somebody really needs to do a study on because it's really fascinating. This is kind of a good case study in the way this worked. Project 100,000 was actually the brainchild of Robert Mcnamara, Secretary of Defense. Mcnamara was trying to combine the best instincts of the Great Society with the Vietnam War, and he latched on this idea of taking 100,000 kids whose scores on a standardized test, before going to Vietnam, you were given a standardized test, kind of a proto-SAT type thing, and do you remember that? Or, I don't know. That by that time, I can't remember if 5 was the best or 1 was the best. I believe they categorized them. Yeah, okay, it was so anywhere up to, I think, Category 3, 1, 2, and 3 were fine. You were accepted. Category 5, you were definitely out. And I'm not sure Category 4 may have been the dividing line. But basically what Project 100,000 did was take kids who fell outside of the eligible categories, maybe 4 and 5, I can't remember what they were, and bring them into Vietnam. Okay? So these tend to be inner city kids who have failed out of high school or have quit school. And the idea there is to kind of use the military as kind of a welfare agency. This is the way the military saw it. It's kind of ironic because everybody hated 100,000. The military hated it because they're getting people who do not have even, they considered, the most basic skills, who were really fundamentally incapable of being taught, the arts of warfare, being trained, and so on. Liberals jumped all over LBJ and McNamara for it because they figured this was just a way to get a bunch of kids who they couldn't do anything with and they didn't have any solutions for and throw them into the military. So this is kind of the way that these things interact and intersect in the Vietnam era. There'd still be a great study sometime if somebody could actually really kind of get behind Project 100,000 and figure the whole thing out. But you see things like this all the time. Anecdotally, you could go on and on and on and on about the type of soldier in Vietnam. Tended to be a working class soldier, somebody who came from a family, could be a middle class family, not necessarily dire poverty, but if you came from a family where you had access to college, you could probably find a way out of Vietnam. In terms of education, again, it was a non-college educated force, and of course there were plenty of college graduates there as well. John Kerry, the head of VVAW, I believe was a Harvard graduate. Al Gore was a Harvard graduate. So certainly that's we're talking about a cross-section, a statistical cross-section, not by no means everybody. And in terms of region or state, southern poor states tended to be more likely. So that's just kind of a general overview of the Vietnam era soldier. I want to talk more specifically now about certain groups in Vietnam. The largest, and that which tended to get the most publicity or have the most coverage, of course, not surprising, was African Americans. And as we pointed out a couple weeks ago, this is particularly acute because the war in Vietnam is occurring at the very same time as the civil rights movement. And so these things intersect. And among African Americans, there's a real connection between the two. There's a great irony in the sense that African Americans, as I said before, there's an anomaly maybe rather than an irony, and that African Americans could be vitriolic critics of the war in Vietnam, and they often were. We've read King's speech and we've heard his passionate words. Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, many, even mainstream black leaders opposed the war in Vietnam, but that's often counterbalanced against the idea that really throughout the 20th century, military service was probably one of the best, if not the best way for African Americans to actually advance in terms of economics or in terms of status. It was a vehicle for social and economic advancement. In World War I, in World War II, in Korea, blacks compiled a very impressive record of military service, even though the military forces were segregated. They had substandard equipment. They were often given menial duties, and they had the worst officers. Despite all that, they performed quite admirably. Vietnam was different in that it was the first integrated war from the beginning, from the get-go. However, if you read things like Wallace Terry's accounts, Wallace Terry was a journalist. He interviewed several African-American soldiers from the Vietnam era. The book was called Bloods. And if you read Bloods, however, even though the units were integrated, and I'll talk more about this later, there clearly was, there were unequal assignments. For example, in the field, if you look at the point man, point is somebody who actually leads the unit into the field, point men generally were black. There's one narrative in there from, I believe the man's name was Malik Edwards, maybe, who talked about getting to Vietnam. I think he may have been in the initial Marine deployment to Da Nang, and looking down the line, and all the point men were black, and he said, you know, in his words, I had some cracker sergeant saying, don't smile at night or they'll see you and shoot, you know. So this is kind of what they're up against. Despite that, as I said, the armed forces seem to offer the best chance for opportunity and advancement. One African-American captain said, basically, the Army affords you as good an opportunity as you can find. There's better or more of an equal opportunity there. And so when you look at motivation for African-Americans, this generally is it. There are basically two reasons, and I'll talk more about that, Chicanos and Native Americans, but they're basically the same in all of these groups. One is just this sense of advancement, of duty, you know, the need to do something. And the other, of course, is economics. You know, people who see this as a chance to have a job, to have possibly even a career. One African-American who was married and had 3 children re-enlisted for 6 years and to serve in Vietnam because, as he said, the job opportunities outside just weren't any good. The Army takes care of me and my family. In 1967, the black unemployment rate was over double the white unemployment rate. That year, when on the outside, the black unemployment rate is double, 49% of blacks in the Army eligible for re-enlistment did so. So half of the African Americans in the Army re-enlisted. Only 16% of whites did, however. So clearly one can infer from this that whites believed that there were opportunities outside the military for employment, whereas blacks were far less likely to believe that, and they stayed in the military. Okay? Why did they stay? Status, self-esteem. One major, Beauregard Brown, said that because of his time in Vietnam, the time in Vietnam, quote, represented a greater chance for advancement of the Negro career military man than any place in the world. This is what we talked about before, basically ticket punching. African Americans feel the same way. If you serve in Vietnam, then you have a better chance to be promoted, to have status that way. So they are looking for, anyway, all things being equal, they believe that the military will not treat them equally, so going to Vietnam may give them a little bit of an advantage. One, Major General Frederick Davison, who was the first black division commander in Vietnam, had to fight with his superiors to get a combat assignment. Other white officers wanted it before him. He said, I wanted to go very badly, but there were no plans to take me. God damn, I nearly lost my family. Nearly lost my family because they just couldn't see why in the hell I had to volunteer to go to Vietnam. And again, it was a way to jumpstart his career. So you have clearly then African Americans who, and in the early years a majority enlisted, who are going to Vietnam basically because it offers them status, it offers them a job, self-esteem. It's a way to avoid the real difficult economic problems on the outside. And at the same time, however, it really wakes them up to the difficulties involved in the kind of unequalness of the whole situation there. African Americans paid a high price for their sacrifices, for re-enlisting, for joining the Army. Blacks made up about 12% of the population of the U.S. in the 1960s. They had disproportionately high rates of wounded and killed in action. African Americans made up about 10% of all the active duty assigned to Vietnam. All right. However, so when you look at that 2.1 million who served in Vietnam, there were about 200,000 or so blacks in that number, about 10%. But when you break it down by combat troops, troops which actually had a chance of seeing fighting, a good chance of seeing fighting, 1/4 to 1/3 were African American, which is a huge statistical disconnection there. 10% of the active duties, yet 25 to 33% of combat soldiers, okay? And 12.6% of all fatalities killed in action by 73. By 1968, which is really a pivot point, the black casualty rate was actually almost double black population. It was in the low 20% range. After 68, I'll mention this later, the Army takes measures because it's becoming socially untenable to maintain these numbers. People like King and others are complaining about it. So the Army takes measures. But up to 1968, over 20% of the casualties in Vietnam are black soldiers, who make up only 10% of the active duty soldiers in Vietnam and only about 12% of the population at large. Okay? And then you throw in things like Project 100,000, and this, you can understand why African American leaders are quite higher. The death rate for black soldiers in Vietnam was about 30% higher than their percentage of forces in Southeast Asia. Of those 58,000 plus names on the wall, over 7,200 of them are African Americans. Okay? Not surprisingly, then, this is going to lead to a lot of blacks who are going to be in an uproar about this. Many saw this, not just African American leaders, but white leaders, liberals, people like SDS as well. I.F. Stone, the radical journalist, all pointed this out, that and as King so powerfully did, that African Americans are fighting and dying disproportionately in Vietnam, while at home, you have the cities burning, you have Malcolm X complaining about Northern, and then Martin Luther King complaining about Northern racism, housing, and things like that. So it's not difficult to sell a lot of people, black and white, on the idea that blacks are being used by a racist military and they're bearing an undue burden. Hence Stokely Carmichael's line about Vietnam being a case where the white man is using the black man to kill the yellow man to protect land he stole from the red man, or something like that. Even black newspapers, there are hundreds of black-owned newspapers, community newspapers in the U.S., and generally these are not radical periodicals, but even the kind of moderate black newspapers by 66 were starting to be disturbed by the numbers in Vietnam. And of course, more militant groups like the Black Panthers were too. Often, groups like the Panthers would accuse the Army of using soldiers in Vietnam as kind of an attempt to create genocide, to put black soldiers on the front line so they would die in these disproportionate numbers, so that they would not be back in the United States agitating for any kind of civil change. The Panthers, in fact, I believe it was the Panthers at one point, said that this was a totalitarian instrument used to practice genocide against black people. I'm sorry, that's a SNCC statement by a SNCC spokesman. So I don't think the U.S. government was frankly efficient enough to actually have a plan to put black soldiers on the line to create genocide, but it's quite clear how one can see African Americans coming to that conclusion. In fact, one thing that was actually, in retrospect, quite laughable was that in 1968 the Department of Defense issued a report which said that racism had been, quote, officially eliminated from the armed forces. So the DOD issued a report that said it. This always reminds me that I always had proof that God was dead because the Constitution in Albania said so. It officially said that God was dead. So, which, yes.
I've been trying to figure out these statistics ever since I did this. I read the thing several weeks ago. I don't understand how, if the highest period for casualties in Vietnam was between 65 and 68.
Yeah.
And if blacks at that point accounted for over 20% of the casualties, but by really the end of the U.S. involvement in the war in 73, the total was down to 12%, which is roughly equivalent to black population in the U.S. That means for those 5 years between 68 and 73, to get it to balance out, black casualties had to be well under 12%.
There were, yeah.
How did they do that?
Well, it's a war. It's a different kind of war. Vietnamization is drawing people in. I'm assuming, and I still haven't been able to figure this out, that what you see in the 69 to 73 period in terms of casualties are going to be Air Force personnel, Air Force is one of the whiter services, people who have kind of skilled assignments, and the Army basically put blacks in the lower lower end of the military occupations, unskilled positions, technicians, and so forth. The advisors, pacification experts, people like that. So my assumption would be, this would be a guess, basically, that the way the war changes with Vietnamization means that it's going to be, more likely that whites are going to be targeted because it's an air war. It's not the same type of, kind of war of search and destroy and attrition that it had been up through '68. But that's more of a guess. I mean, people are just now starting to kind of research this in some good detail. There's a book that came out a couple years ago by a guy named James Westhider about blacks in Vietnam. There are memoirs and oral histories and things like that. And I'm sure, that these numbers are in the DOD somewhere. I just haven't seen them yet. But that would be just my guess, my educated guess on it. But no, I mean, there's no question that black casualty rates go way down. And there's also, a concerted effort to do that because King is pointing that out. 68's an ugly year. Even before 68, you have riots in Newark and Detroit and Watts. And after King's death in '68, the country, explodes. I mean, every major city has some form of riot. There's billions of dollars in damage. And so the military clearly sees the writing on the wall, and they really make, aggressive efforts to try to deal with this. Yeah.
I think what also may have happened is, and I'm looking at some casualty rates by years here, if you consider that that black soldiers were enlisting and being drafted in, say, 1967, and they would serve for 2 years. But 1969, there were 11,000 soldiers killed. That means that there would have been a lower percentage. My guess is that a lot of black soldiers got assignments outside of Vietnam at that time, like to Germany, because there was a lot of things going on in Germany. They were building up the forces there. So in order to meet the objectives of what was going on back here in terms of concerns, you could have diverted black soldiers to those locations. That's certainly a study that someone would have to do. In 1970, there were 6,000 casualties. So it drops off considerably, and by that time, like you say, Vietnamization had taken over, and there weren't as many combat jobs available out in the field.
I also think the lottery system's kicking in by then too, so whites aren't able to use all the same vehicles to get out that they once did.
There was only 1 year where there was a lottery system with no 2S, and it was 1971, I believe, and then they ended the draft right after that.
Yeah.
When did the Project 100,000 end? 68 with the end of
pretty
Johnson?
much. It was fairly short-lived. I think 66, 68, somewhere around there. I forget the number of. The idea was to get 100,000 soldiers in the field. I don't think they actually got that many in there, and I've never seen a good word written about Project 100,000. McNamara actually still thought it was a great idea. Still, I think he may have mentioned it in his memoirs. I can't remember, but McNamara still did. But it was a pretty abysmal failure, and everybody saw in it the worst of all things. I think there are a lot of statistical reasons for that, but clearly, I think the biggest one was the Army was just afraid. They were afraid that they were going to have a huge racial war on their hands in Vietnam, in addition to the Vietnam War. And there were clear instances of that. You had some real ugly incidents in Vietnam. Actually, that's good. That's kind of a good segue. I talked about kind of casualty rates, but another thing that African Americans complained about with great intensity was the draft, the selective service system, and the selective service system provided the bulk of manpower in Vietnam after the initial stages of the war in '65 and '66, and it had a tremendous impact on the black community. Technically, selective service is supposed to make all men between 18 and 26 eligible. But beginning in the 50s, the Pentagon instituted this fairly complex system of deferments based on education or profession or whatever, which of course limits the manpower pool. And of course, in real terms, this means that the white, middle, and upper classes who can go to college are basically exempt from the war. There's a real breaking line here between college and non-college. And the majority of draftees who fight in Vietnam are from black and white working class families. This isn't legal discrimination in the sense that anyone is prohibited from getting a deferment, but in real terms, obviously the number of white high school graduates going to college is going to be larger than the number of black high school graduates going to college. The dropout rates are more high in poor areas, in urban areas, and so forth. African Americans, as early as 1966, 75% of blacks believed that in a Gallup poll, believed that the Selective Service, I'm sorry, actually this is a different thing. In 66, 75% of blacks still believed that the Selective Service was being fair to minorities. So as late as 1966, there wasn't any great perception yet that the draft was unduly hurting African Americans. But within a year or two, that began to change, and soon the numbers would be pretty much reversed. Blacks who were eligible for the draft made up about 11% of the population during the war. However, the numbers of blacks actually drafted were always higher. In 1966, 13.4% of the men drafted were black. In 1967, over 16% of the men drafted were black. For the war as a whole, blacks made up over 14% of the total drafted. Again, statistically about 20% higher than their proportion of the population. For example, in 1967, less than 1/3 of acceptable whites were actually drafted into military service, where over 2/3 of acceptable blacks were, which means that blacks were twice as likely to be drafted as whites. This was not lost upon African American leaders. Martin Luther King, among others, blasted it. John Lewis of SNCC did not believe that blacks were obliged to enter the draft. He said, "We have a different reason for not going." I'm sorry, this is a different SNCC leader. "We have a different reason for not going. The whites are resisting as citizens. We resist on the grounds that we aren't citizens." People like Lewis and others basically made the point that we are not sharing in any of the rewards of American society. Why should we pay the price for this? The composition of local draft boards also aggravated the situation. There were over 4,000 draft boards in the United States. Of that 4,000 draft boards, only 1.3% in 1966 of draft officials were black. By 1968, it was still only 4%. So the chances of actually appearing before a draft board that had a black face on it were almost nil. They were incredibly small. And it was these local draft boards that decided upon whether somebody could get a deferment or whether somebody had to serve. In some areas, I mean, West Hyder has anecdotes about draft boards, for example, in Louisiana, where they literally just, tell white folks that, they don't have to serve. I had a friend here in Texas whose father claims, his story related by his father was that they told him, this guy was, I believe, in engineering or some kind of one of the sciences, and they quite frankly told him, "We're not going to send you to fight, we'll send a nigger in your place." This is in Texas, in a draft board with, all white officers serving before it. Not surprising. I mean, yeah.
I just want to ask a general question. I want to make sure I understand this right. The draft only affects certain services like the Army, other services remain voluntary to a certain throughout, or?
Marines have never had a draft. Navy's never had a draft. Air Force, no. It's an Army. It's an Army, yeah. Because the Army always needed more manpower, yeah. Whites were more likely to get deferments and conscientious objector status, which was Muhammad Ali's complaint. He actually, I mean, it wasn't on racial grounds specifically that he refused to go to Vietnam. It was based on religious grounds, that as a member of the Nation of Islam, he was a pacifist. And they rejected that, whereas they were allowing white Christians to have CO status, Quakers and Unitarians and others like that. I've seen, Ali wasn't the only one. He was just the most high-profile one, and there's no question they were trying to make an example out of him. The number of professional athletes who served in Vietnam is minuscule. I mean, I can think of one off the top of my head, a guy who played for the Pittsburgh Steelers, Rocky Blyer, was actually wounded in Vietnam. I mean, when you consider DiMaggio, Feller, Ted Williams, all these guys served in World War II in Korea. I mean, many of them lost 3-4 full years out of their careers, and I can't think of anybody other than Rocky Blyer. I mean, there may be one, but I can't think of any professional athletes off the top of my head. And to draft Ali was simply outrageous. It was simply a way to put him in his place. He was a loud, aggressive, and intelligent black man, and they were going to put him where he belonged. That was the only reason for it. It was truly an outrage. His conviction was later overturned Actually, of all the people at that time, the only one who really stood up for him was Howard Cosell. This is how they kind of cemented their relationship. And Cosell really kind of took it on the chin. He got death threats, he got everything, but Cosell was just really quite blatant about, just how outrageous this was. To draft Ali, it was simply, just unconscionable. It was just truly outrageous. In fact, over 100 Muslims served time in federal prison for draft evasion in the Vietnam era. So Ali was certainly not alone. And if black resistors were not able to get a deferment and were sent to jail, they were more likely to spend an extra year in jail than whites convicted of draft evasion. So the average sentence for a black draft evader was about 25% longer than the average sentence for a white draft evader. Okay? So the draft, obviously, is a real source of friction in the black community. So, too, the whole concept of military career and promotions, assignments, and so forth. When one enters the military, he or she gets an MOS, which is a military occupational specialty. This is the acronym I spaced out on a few minutes ago. Military occupational specialty, an MOS, which is basically what you do. It's your assignment. MOS often is based upon something called the AFQT, the Armed Forces Qualification Test. It's essentially kind of a juiced up IQ, SAT type thing. It's a standardized test. And your score on the test will determine your assignment. The better score you do, the more likely you are to go to officer school or to get a position and assignment that is not going to put you so much in harm's way. Whites generally score much better on their Armed Forces Qualification Test and get better MOSs for a couple reasons. One, they had more education before entering the armed forces. And the other, which is really kind of a common complaint for any kind of standardized testing, is that these tests betrayed a certain Eurocentric white cultural bias. A bonus for growing up white, some black servicemen said. Because blacks generally scored lower on their armed forces qualification test, they were not able to get into the technical fields that were more lucrative and quite often, almost always in fact, were slotted into service and infantry units, and generally this meant you were going to Vietnam. There's a little sidebar to this what's really interesting. In 1972, the armed forces scrapped the old test and they replaced it with a test which African Americans considered less biased and more neutral. And after that new test was instituted, white scores remained the same and black scores rose considerably, which gives credibility to the old argument, their argument that the old test was racially skewed. And this has been, I think, proven time and again with things like the SATs and GREs and MCATs and all that kind of stuff. These are really lucrative billion-dollar industries which really do preserve a certain status quo. Okay? So you can tell ETS is never going to sponsor my class. Okay? So the testing for MOS was skewed to begin with. Promotion and assignment policies were as well. Wallace Terry, a journalist who edited Bloods, found that almost 2/3 of blacks believed that whites were being promoted faster than blacks. And this was based on what was actually happening in Vietnam. Blacks tended to be concentrated in infantry and service units. The average rifle company was 50 to 60% black and Hispanic. Okay, so blacks tend to be concentrated in infantry and service units, which are not as likely to lead to promotion or to NCO status. Few blacks had the service time to qualify for that. As late as 1972, 17% of the Army's enlisted strength was black, but only 7% of the sergeant and warrant officers were black. Okay, so again, this is another area which is a cause for great problem. So too was the whole idea of military justice. I put a quotation mark around there because there's an old saying: military justice is to justice as military music is to music. And with all apologies to John Philip Sousa, the military justice system tends to work at its own dynamic. A Pentagon task force on military justice, the Pentagon itself concluded in '72 that African Americans were twice as likely as white men to be brought up for military trial. The type of crimes charged with, blacks and whites charged with, was quite different. More than 40% of black defendants were charged with major military infractions like attacking an officer, which many blacks claimed was a racially motivated, white officers were racially motivated in their behavior, and therefore these attacks were defensive. Whites usually face court-martial for lesser infractions. Over 75% of the drug-related violations, which were not considered major, like attacking an officer, were white offenders. Blacks were more likely to receive longer prison sentences than whites. Remember, I said for draft evasion, it was about a year longer. Within the military, African Americans convicted of courts-martial generally served 3 years, while whites served a little over 2 years. So inside the military as well, blacks get longer sentences. African Americans, for the most part, don't have much faith in the military justice system, and it's not surprising. Less than 2% of the Judge Advocate General, the JAG's defense lawyers, judges, and prosecutors are black. Okay? So even though a significant number of the defendants are black, less than 2% of the military's own judicial appointees, judges, lawyers, and so forth, prosecutors, are black. This is really incredible. In 1972, there are 1,700 military lawyers, 17 African Americans, 1%, 1 out of 100. Okay? Meanwhile, the defendants are typically African American. Black defendants don't trust their white lawyers. One NCO stationed in Germany told an NAACP committee, quote, "I've been in the service for 14 years. I've never seen a white JAG lawyer do anything for a black man." And this tended to be a fairly common held view. When the Pentagon did a survey of prisoners, military prisoners, 2/3 of the white prisoners believed that they had had a fair trial, but less than half of African Americans believed that they had a fair trial. Therefore, it's not surprising more blacks were confined in military prisons. In 1971, blacks were 1/4 of all military confinements in the Marines, 1/3 of all Army prisoners, and over half of the Air Force's prisoners, which is really striking considering that the Air Force is not, does not have a significant number of black service personnel. Even though blacks constitute only 8% of the Navy's numbers, 16% of the Navy's prison population was African American. Okay? There's another type, short of imprisonment or court-martial of punishment, called non-judicial punishment. Non-judicial punishment is the right of any officer or non-commissioned officer to write somebody up for an infraction, but the actual guilt or the punishment was determined by a commanding officer or a ship's captain in a hearing. It wasn't a formal military hearing like a court-martial, and the punishment could simply be a letter of reprimand. It could be a slap on the wrist, could be a few weeks in a brigade or something like that. African Americans generally in some areas made up about 15% of a particular unit, but got over 1/3 of these non-judicial punishments. There was a clear double standard in that. Blacks were given non-judicial punishments for wearing slave bracelets, these braided bracelets, which violated the uniform code. Whites were not given non-judicial punishments at the same rate, for example, for wearing peace signs on their helmet or for wearing fraternity rings, which were no different than wearing a slave bracelet. One member of the Nation of Islam was given several non-judicial punishments for refusing to eat at the mess hall on certain religious holidays. Black and Jewish prisoners were able to get Bibles, whereas Muslims could not get a Quran. In many cases, black soldiers claimed that their officers were abusing the system. One platoon sergeant was finally fired because he would wake white soldiers up for work call, but he wouldn't wake up the black soldiers, and then they would get non-judicial punishments, Article 15s, for being late. The Pentagon itself concluded, quote, "There's enough evidence of intentional discrimination by individuals to convince this task force that selective punishments is, in fact, in many cases, racially motivated." The Army itself could not deny that. Because of this, then, not surprisingly, we've talked about this before, there's a real sense of alienation within the black community, and there's a real link then between racial views at home and their opinions on the war. So there's a real sense of alienation and an increase in anti-war views because of racial attitudes in Vietnam. One private, a black private, said, America's fighting this war so that the white man could put buku money in his pocket. To hell with this war. If a cracker wants to stay here and fight, let him. If they kick his ass too damn bad, it's about time somebody did. These are not at all unusual. You could find scores of quotes like this. One private, speaking for many of his black comrades, said, they say I'm just a Marine, but how can I forget 18 years of being black and all that being black means in this country? So all of a sudden you're given this rhetoric about fighting for democracy and freedom. In the South Vietnamese, and as King pointed out, they're fighting and dying together for rights that they could never share. These kids wouldn't go to the same school, they wouldn't live in the same block, and yet they're fighting in the same war in Vietnam. There was a real sense of alienation among black soldiers too, because they didn't believe that the military officer corps was really concerned about these racial incidents. The Pentagon did little, for example, to investigate cases of abuse or verbal abuse. Latrines often had graffiti on them, which said things like, coons go back to Africa, niggers eat shit. That was not at all unusual, and basically when black soldiers complained to their officers about that, they just kind of turned away and told them to get over it. Confederate flags could be common, not necessarily were, but they could be common on certain bases. Certainly not at all unusual to have white soldiers at a base camp put a Confederate flag up. And in fact, after King was killed in April of '68, several units flew Confederate flags, which precipitated racial incidents. There were actually fights going on between black and white soldiers in Vietnam. One soldier was talking about one of some of the white guys in his unit, and he said, Chuck's all right until he gets a beer under his belt. And then it's nigger this and nigger that. So quite often these racial feelings came out. Armies were dominated obviously by the white establishment. Simple things like post exchanges, the PX system mitigated against that. Post exchanges don't carry black hair care products or clothes or magazines that might be more popular among black soldiers. One private in Vietnam wrote a letter to Ebony magazine thanking Ebony for covering African Americans in the war, because the mainstream media wasn't doing that. He said, every time a soul brother gets an Ebony or a Jet magazine, there's a waiting line of at least another 30 to 50 soul brothers throughout our troop waiting to read it. The black people in the U.S. don't know what it means to be a black soldier, to have magazines such as Ebony and Jet to call their own. Things like the Black Panther newspaper were very hard to find, but occasionally made their way over to Vietnam as well. Even things that people might say are insignificant really contributed to the sense of alienation. In Germany, there was an army barracks named in honor of Robert E. Lee. Black soldiers did not miss the import of that. More recreational facilities were geared toward whites. One black said, you don't see a whole lot of brothers out there on the skeet range. The jukeboxes, it may sound silly, but the jukeboxes rarely carried James Brown, Aretha Franklin, Motown, music like that. Generally it was country and western artists, and one might think that's kind of a, so what, it's insignificant, but in fact a large number of fights in the armed forces, in military clubs, broke out over things like jukebox music. And there was this real sense that blacks really had no say in any of this. I think there's something in Good Morning Vietnam kind of along these lines. So what, and of course, when you talk about the African Americans in the Vietnam War, the two dominant figures, as I pointed out before, are Martin Luther King and Muhammad Ali. I mean, Ali's refusal, I think, really is a pivot point. It's really a turning point in 1967. When Ali refuses induction, it forces black men throughout the country to really confront what this war means. He is maybe the most famous man in the world by that time, undefeated heavyweight champion, incredibly charismatic, who puts his title on the line. I mean, Ali could have easily found some kind of deal, cut a deal. I mean, celebrities have always done this. Joe Louis used to do kind of PR stuff for the Army. Ali could have easily cut a deal. He refused to do so. He was stripped of his title. He was convicted of draft evasion, though later overturned. And I think this really kind of alarmed and woke up African Americans. I can't think of any figure in that period more important than him, and of course Martin Luther King. And I mean, King gives his April 4th, 1967 speech against the war, and Ali refuses induction really within a few months of each other. And so this really, I think, really creates a massive awareness on behalf of black America that something's happening in Vietnam. We want to be good patriotic Americans. We're willing to enlist, but this is an unfair war. 20% or more of the casualties are black, even though we don't make up a percentage of the population. The Great Society is essentially falling apart, and we're being asked to fight in Vietnam. So King and Ali, I think, really crystallized views in the black community on what it means to be a soldier in Vietnam. So what happens then? What are some of the responses of African Americans? They are, of course, varied, and they're all over the place. Many, perhaps the most typical, was simply going through the system, going through accepted channels. Blacks would often petition for things like more black products at the PX, more black music at the clubs. Black cadets at the Air Force Academy asked for equitable enforcement of the regulations and a minority studies room. So quite often they were just simply kind of putting the equivalent of writing a letter to your congressman. They were just simply asking for more. Others wouldn't go through official channels, though, because they believed that the reprisal would be too great. One black soldier who served 3 tours of duty in Vietnam said, if you were black and you spoke up, you were considered a troublemaker, an instigator, whatever. If you were white, you were considered an innovator. So there was a real fear on behalf of African American soldiers to complain about anything. At Camp Lejeune in North Carolina in 1969, black Marines petitioned their commanding officer, but did so anonymously because they believed that even a timid, mild-toned missive would lead to reprisals. So there was a real kind of repressive element there, a real sense that we can't speak up about any of these problems. So in some regard, blacks worked through the system to try to address their grievances. Others, like white soldiers, would put messages on their helmets. Black power, black is beautiful. Many wore slave bracelets. Some began carrying black power canes, which were made of ebony with a clenched fist at the top, not unlike the fist that, probably in the most famous photo, Smith and Carlos used at the 68 Olympics. Probably the most important cultural expression and the kind of most significant form of cultural protest was the dap, which was a ritualized handshake. I never knew this, but dap actually comes from a Vietnamese word dep, meaning beautiful. I didn't realize it was actually kind of a Vietnam War innovation. And black soldiers would engage in these kind of complicated and sophisticated daps, which would clench fists and touch the back of their hands and so forth, which was kind of a symbol of cultural identification. Soldiers were often penalized. They were often punished for dapping. Yeah, I mean, there really are cases of soldiers being given punishments for engaging in a dap. There's simply this sense that they don't know. I mean, the white officers in Vietnam really see kind of threats and all this. They see this as possibly a threat. So what you have then is really this sense that blacks are afraid of even cultural expression could be taken the wrong way. Stateside patterns of segregation, the type of segregation that African American soldiers are used to, which they think that the military might change, that doesn't happen. African Americans are thrown out of clubs. In Vietnam, basically the social life can often be segregated. There are particular areas which cater to black soldiers or white soldiers. They go to different bars, they go to different drug dealers, they go to different brothels. And it really is kind of segregated in a lot of ways. Racially segregated barracks. I mean, you've seen, like Platoon, which is separated between, you kind of have the country and Western guys who drink beer and listen to Merle Haggard, and then you have the other group which has a lot of African American soldiers in it who smoke dope, and they're kind of listening to Jimi Hendrix and whatnot. And again, it's a movie device, but it's also consistent with a lot of memoirs and a lot of soldiers' recollections of Vietnam. So these are the kind of responses you get. In fact, I was speaking about the DAP. I knew there was something in here. Well, there's two really striking stories. One Marine corporal had taunted a black private in the Marines about dapping, told him he couldn't do it anymore, and so the private killed him. And in 1969, the Marine Commandant, Leonard Chapman, issued a directive basically banning the DAP. He banned all action, signs, symbols, or words contrary to tradition. So the Marines actually banned dapping altogether. This is kind of how serious it became. Many African Americans actually were willing to advocate violence. One soldier, John White, serving a tour, said that Caucasians were his enemy. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese weren't the enemy. He said, "No more talk. Let's just kill them off, or they'll kill us off." That's how bad it is here. Now, that's probably one of the most extreme cases you'll see, but a lot of folks really had it up to there. As I said before, after the King assassination too. After King's assassination, some whites, as a black soldier recalled, expressed overjoy that this troublemaker had been eliminated. Some whites at Cameron Bay paraded around in makeshift Ku Klux Klan outfits and hoisted a Confederate flag over the Navy headquarters buildings. Others could care less. One white military policeman said, "We have 300 Americans dying here each week. King was just one guy." And so in all kinds of ways, subtle and very significant, African Americans have to deal with this. White soldiers often are the targets of fragging too by black soldiers, because there was this general collapse of morale in Vietnam. One soldier, especially after the King assassination, said, "Dr. King's death changed things and made a lot of people angry, people who knew how to use weapons," okay, which was clearly... And you could go on about incidents like this, racial melees, a large riot at Camp Lejeune when an interracial couple was dancing, one dead, dozens injured, 44 arrested. The Navy in 1972 was forced to temporarily close a service club at Bethesda and the Navy Medical Center because of a racial riot at that point. And, one could go on and on and on and on. There was this real sense, though, that African-American soldiers in Vietnam really were seeing in the service what they were seeing at home, possibly even in kind of even in more intense ways. So what does the military do about it? They first kind of start transferring out and clearing out people who were considered radicals, African Americans who were considered militant, who were considered organizers and whatnot. They were often convicted of anti-war activity. They were court-martialed, dishonorably discharged, and so forth. So one way was very coercive. The other way was actually through reform. The military understood that this problem, although clearly racially, the military understood this problem was clearly racially motivated, and so they start to institute reforms to try to address this. Testing and promotion policies were changed. The judicial system was tidied up. It was tweaked so that more black lawyers were brought into it. The overt racism involved in it was tempered a bit. Commanding officers' discretionary powers, which could be quite wide, were limited. Commanding officers could often, kind of basically convict and punish, try, convict, and punish without much interference. In 1969, the Army and Marines both opened racial relations program, racial sensitivity programs. The Air Force begins to assign equal opportunity employment officers to its installations. In the Navy, you have maybe the most far-reaching reform. Admiral Elmo Zumwalt becomes the commandant in 1970, and Zumwalt is, kind of, some of the old guard can't handle Zumwalt. They consider him a hippie. He allows Navy sailors to grow sideburns and just kind of loosens things up, and he institutes, Zumwalt was kind of a liberal in that regard. In terms of race relations, he institutes a large number of racial reform programs within the Navy, 200 new race relations and equal opportunity programs. By 1972, Vietnam War is almost over. All of the services have fairly comprehensive affirmative action programs and open a lot of assignments to blacks that were once closed. So in that regard, the military, in its own way, is often ahead of the curve in some of these things. The new reforms in the long term make life better. I mean, you don't have the same kind of racial violence and over racism that you did in the Vietnam era. In terms of for the soldiers in Vietnam, they didn't do a whole lot because they weren't instituted until over that. Since then, you have more black officers. Colin Powell made chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and whatnot. So there clearly has been some progress on this count, although one can debate just what it means. But all of these unquestionably are reactions to the Vietnam era. I just want to briefly talk about, Chicanos and Native Americans next time, but we're going to see Jonathan Shea coming up, who's going to talk about soldiers and veterans of the Vietnam War. Thank you.